Webinar kali ini akan mengundang beberapa ahli.
So we have several experts, and they will be discussing about important aspects on cases involving vast quantities of assets, as mentioned by the Oslo Statement on Corruption involving vast quantities of assets that consider prevention, transparency of state operations, asset recovery, financial investigation, protection of victims and whistleblowers, as well as remedial actions. Protection of enforcers is a prominent element to support other aspects. I would like to introduce our expert resource persons today. We have 5 expert speakers. Let me start with Mr. Francesco Checchi, and he is the Senior Anti-Corruption Officer with UNODC. And second, the distinguished Dato Azam Baki, the Chief Commissioner of MACC. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Our third speaker is we have Mr. Muhammad Asri Irwan, the prosecutor from the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission, KPK. We also have Ms. Sophie Schut, Senior Program Advisor of U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. Her doctoral research is about the management of manpower in KPK, and she is also involved in many anti-corruption studies, focusing on natural resources as well as the criminal justice system. Our next speaker is Ms. Bivitri Susanti from Transparency International Indonesia, also a renowned academia in policy studies and legal studies. Before we start the session, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Collie Brown from UNODC Country Manager to give the opening remarks. So, Mr. Collie Brown, the floor is yours.
Hi, Putri, thank you very, very, very much. And let me also add my voice and concerns to everyone regarding the being safe in this period that we're going through. I do also want to just add quickly my voice in terms of acknowledging all the distinguished members of the panel, my good friend, I see Francesco, and also Putri. I want to also extend thanks to you for organizing this event, and as well do want to acknowledge Dato Sri Azam Baki, the Chief Commissioner of the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Commission. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome all of you this afternoon. This webinar is being held in a global pandemic environment where we've seen extraordinary measures being taken to respond to this unprecedented health emergency and to avoid a global economic collapse. In developing countries, of course, the potential impact cannot be overstated. Factors such as double digits rates of poverty are exacerbated, and whatever resilience they may have had can easily be overwhelmed. In Indonesia, we know that the government has committed trillions of rupiah for social safety net programs. This includes in-kind and cash social assistance to the poor and various incentives for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. Unfortunately, we have seen and we will continue to see criminals who see this as an opportunity to divert these public assets for their personal gain. And unless we use vigilance, unless we have heightened awareness and countermeasures are put in place, they most likely will succeed. And so today we're pleased that we have this expert panel who will provide us some perspective, invaluable perspective, I might add, on the issue and what can be done to prevent these nefarious actors from benefiting from this unprecedented pandemic. Over the years, we know that the Indonesia Corruption Eradication Commission has demonstrated its experience and its competence in handling large-scale corruption. And we're pleased to have the representative from the from KPK with us today. Similarly, we're pleased to have the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Commission with us today. Certainly, we know that the MACC has demonstrated its ability to manage corruption, and particularly corruption involving large quantities of assets. And I'm sure we're looking forward to hearing them share their experience along with the lessons learned, particularly in the recent case that we know they had, the 1MDB case, where this large quantity of money and certainly the persons involved, I'm sure presented them significant challenges. No doubt we see in many parts of the world where certainly I think with the vigilance of anti-corruption agencies and anti-corruption authorities pushing back, particularly during this time when they are really bringing their experience and their authority to bear. We do see pushbacks in many instances because those who are involved in these acts really don't like to see them succeed. And so it'll really be interesting to also have further enlightenment and further discussion on the Oslo statement on corruption involving vast quantities of assets, and to identify the relevant issues to consider in preventing and combating corruption involving these assets. Now, among the various aspects covered by the statement, and as you'll hear, the aspects of prevention, transparency of state operation, asset recoveries, and so on and so forth. In this respect, certainly it is recommended that authorities involved in the investigation, in the prosecution and adjudication of these types of corruption cases have the sufficient powers, the independence, and the resources to investigate and prosecute such cases. I'll leave that further, though, for the panel to further elaborate on this. And so in closing, let me welcome all of you and to encourage you to give your attention to the next 2 or 3 hours for this very important subject. I also encourage you to become engaged in the discussion, whether that's questions in the chat box or your voices and your questions and your comments during the open session. With that, let me pause here. And again, let me thank all of you for being with us. And I look forward to the rest of the webinar. Thank you very much. And Putri, let me hand this back to you.
Thank you so much, Pak, for your opening remarks. Terima kasih banyak, Bapak Collie Brown. Memang kita harapannya.
Thank you for opening remarks. And yes, indeed, in this time of pandemic, we can remain productive. And of course, we're still committed to eradicating and preventing corruption, and UNODC is pleased to be able to support you in this efforts. So I would like to move on to our first agenda, to our first speaker, Mr. Francesco Checchi. Are you there?
Hello, Francesco.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Kita akan mulai di sesi pertama kita.
So we're going to start with our first speaker, Mr. Checchi, and then we'll follow up with the second speaker with Dato Asri Azam Baki. The third speaker is presentation from Mr. Muhammad Asri, representing KPK. The fourth speaker is the insights from Ms. Sophie Shud, and the fifth speaker will be Ms. Bivitri Susanti, representing the civil society organization. So, Mr. Francesco Checchi, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Putri. Thank you, colleagues, for organizing. Hello to everybody, fellow panelists. I'm glad to see so many participating in the webinar, which is a statement of the importance of the subject. So I will make a brief reference to the legal framework that we have with regard to addressing corruption in vast quantities, and some of the efforts that the UNODC has put forward for tackling this specific type of pernicious problem. So to start with the UN Convention Against Corruption, even though it does not have specific measures related in particular to what we can define as vast quantity of assets, it has a reference to it in its preamble. So the state parties made reference to the fact that they are particularly concerned about corruption in vast quantities that undermines political stabilities and the economy of states. So while the international community adopted the UN Convention Against Corruption 15 years ago, and it's made tremendous effort to curb corruption, corruption cases continue to frequently make headlines. In particular, those involving politically exposed persons or high quantities of assets. And we have here, of course, Dato Azam Baki, who will talk about the 1MDB case, which is obviously probably the biggest case in terms of assets, or among the biggest cases in terms of assets in the region. So I'm looking forward to hearing from him on this. But the point is, these cases very often involve politically exposed persons and a complex network of accountants, lawyers, shell companies, financial institutions, and so they are particularly difficult to investigate, particularly difficult also to recover stolen assets, particularly difficult to, when these assets are recovered, to make sure that the assets go back into funding, for instance, compensation for victims. So there are very many problems around these cases. And to tackle this, the Conference of State Parties to the UNCAC in 2017 produced Resolution 7.2 that calls for a comprehensive and multidisciplinary approach to preventing and combating corruption more effectively, and in particular corruption involving vast quantities of assets. So state parties in that occasion expressed their concern about exacerbation of poverty and inequality through corruption and the negative impact of all forms of corruption, most notably for the disadvantaged individuals in our society. So following up to this resolution, UNODC organized a series of expert group meetings to look more precisely into the issue of corruption involving vast quantities of assets. So the three expert group meetings gathered between in 2018, 2019, they gathered in Lima, Peru, in Prague, Czech Republic, and in Oslo, and developed a series of recommendations which are really quite comprehensive and interesting to look at. I will share the link to the Oslo statement on corruption, on addressing corruption involving vast quantity of assets. I will share it in the chat box at the end of my presentation. So just to resume very briefly, because the statement is very broad, but I want to highlight only a few aspects of it. First thing which I find interesting is that the experts highlighted the fact that corruption involving vast quantity of assets could not be defined on the basis of strict monetary thresholds. So we cannot really quantify at which point a case becomes of vast quantities. We need to take into account the country-specific context, including, the economic development of the country in which the case occurred. So we can talk about millions, we can talk about billions of dollars, depends. The other important element, as I mentioned before, is the presence of the involvement in the case of either politically exposed persons, sort of people entrusted with prominent functions in the state, or their family members or close associated. The expert group meeting, in fact, was concerned about the staggering amount of assets stolen by politically exposed persons, often using those assets for financing political campaigns, and of course acquiring luxury goods and an interesting and very expensive luxury lifestyle as well. But the experts highlighted the fact that such large-scale corruption is depriving states of the resources required to provide vital public services such as healthcare, education, housing, food, and basic infrastructure. In addition to the impact on economic development, several of the presentation at the expert group meeting confirmed the impact on peace, security, upholding of human rights, climate change, biodiversity. So in many circumstances, this kind of high-level corruption can be extremely pernicious, I would say, for overall the achievement of the SDGs. And the main problem really highlighted by the expert is impunity. That in many cases the culprits, are not held accountable. They are not punished, especially when we're talking about politically exposed persons. So there was also a discussion on how these corruption in vast quantity cases look like. So in terms of the provenance, and this is quite interesting, of the information that makes possible such cases, mostly it comes from whistleblowers of various nature, as well as from investigative journalists, cooperating witnesses, and in some cases also from asset declarations, and also in other cases from spontaneous cooperation from foreign jurisdictions. So obviously it's very important for the authorities to protect and make sure that these channels of information are there and are effective. Also, the expert group meeting identified which are the key enablers of corruption involving vast quantity of assets. And they identify the fact that more often than not, there are corporate structures involved in the case to basically conceal financial transactions, conceal beneficial ownership. There is most often than not the involvement of financial and legal intermediaries willing to assist corrupt actors in hiding stolen assets abroad, as well as we see frequent harassment, intimidation, physical attacks on witnesses, whistleblower, and also, and I want to stress this in particular, on those investigating this kind of corruption. So the Oslo statement, I mean, I don't want to go through the whole set of recommendations. As I said, I will put the link, but for instance, it highlights the necessity of a very effective system of asset and interest declarations, in particular, of course, for politically exposed persons and their family members. Another important point is transparency in the management of state-owned and controlled enterprises, obviously because they are handling high-value contracts for service delivery. So there is a great scope for corruption in this operation. And also the recommendations cover various aspects of beneficial ownership, which is a very important topic, debated a lot in Indonesia, Indonesia being one of the countries that is taking the lead in the development of beneficial ownership registries in the region. Also, the importance of strategies to reduce corruption risks in particular sector that are corruption prone, such as defense, infrastructure, energy, extractive industries, and so on, was also highlighted by the experts. The experts also discussed the responsibility of enablers, such as lawyers and accountants, and all these professions that may facilitate the concealment of transactions through legal structures, and that provide advice on how to invest funds, in particular internationally, highlighting the issues around client-attorney privilege, for instance, and the necessity of clear customer due diligence requirements. Of course, the recommendations also cover anti-money laundering, especially with regard to financial institutions. That has to be enhanced when we're looking at the politically exposed persons. But also, as Collie mentioned in his welcoming remarks, one of the highlights of the statement is protection of enforcers. So the recommendations are like that authorities involved in the investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of corruption cases involving vast quantity of assets should have the necessary powers, independence, resources to investigate and prosecute such cases. And the type of pressures that the investigators may receive when it comes to investigating these cases are enormous, both from political actors as well as from fellow law enforcement authorities. We know that politically exposed persons have a lot of connection, a lot of possibilities to get involved in the procedures for the conduction of this kind of investigation. So it is very, very important to have not only the safeguards against any possible interference or undue pressure, but also to have a system of really protection in terms of even physical protection from harms or protection from harassment that investigators may receive from various sources, even we don't know, even maybe internally from their own authorities. So there's also, of course, the issue of whistleblower protection, which I mentioned before. And finally, a couple of issues that I really wanted to highlight are related to the remedial action, whereby it is also recommended that assets recovered from corruption involving vast quantity of assets should benefit, to the extent possible, the victims, the society, and local community that have been harmed by corruption in the first place. So it is a very, very comprehensive set of recommendations. Because I'm not going through all of them, but just some highlights. I will post the link in the chat. Beside this statement, the UNODC, together with the UNDP and other partners, has produced the Jakarta Principles, which for the name they have to be mentioned because they were negotiated in Jakarta in 2012 on anti-corruption agencies, and these principles include the various elements that should be in place for a well-functioning anti-corruption agency, and include independence, resources, clear mandates, and as I mentioned before, also here the capacity to conduct investigation independently and free from undue pressure. So I will post the link to the Jakarta statement as well. So I will stop here. I'll give the floor back to Putri and my fellow panelists, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih banyak Francesco telah sharing mengenai.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for sharing about the Oslo statement and the Jakarta statement that actually managed to fill the gap in UNCSC. Hopefully, the link that Francesco provided can be accessed by all participants. In those two references, you can see that those documents, as Francesco mentioned earlier, compile the experiences of the invited and expert group meetings in Lima, Peru, Oslo, Norway, and I forgot the other country.
Czech Republic.
Yeah, Czech Republic. Now, let us go to the next session, which will be presented by Dato Sri Azam Baki. Good afternoon, Dato. Assalamualaikum. How are you?
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dato, for your willingness to attend this event and share the Malaysian experience in one MDB case, which is actually quite prominently reported in different media. We also want to hear about the success of Malaysia in prosecuting the one MDB case. Dato, we would like to invite you to start your presentation, and for question and answer, we will have it after all the presenters present. Please, Dato.
Assalamualaikum. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Putri, my friend panelists, my good friend, Mr. Francesco. First of all, thank you so much to the organization for inviting me on behalf of MACC to present. To give some thought on about this, the biggest scandal I may say in this decade. One NAB scandal is perhaps the most serious corruption scandal that has been recorded in Malaysia or in my country. The scandal involved the embezzlement and laundering of billions of Malaysian ringgit from the company's account, furthermore with gains from bribery and bond pricing. It was facilitated by false declaration by its officials, amongst others. The illicit money was often transferred outside Malaysia to be laundered. A cohort of bankers, businessmen, and senior government officials, mainly from Malaysia, but some from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries, have been implicated in this scandal. The investigation started early in July 2015, and the spotlight has been placed on the former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, who was also chairman of the One NAB Advisory Board. His wife also, Rosmah Mansor, was involved in this scandal, and also the fugitive of Malaysian citizen Low Tek Jo, or Jolo, a Malaysian businessman and associate partner of Mr. Najib Razak. Another company that was simultaneously being investigated was SRC International. The investigation not only conducted in Malaysia, but also in other countries where the embezzled and other illicit money has been deposited and laundered. The investigation intensified in 2018, ensuing the change of government in Malaysia. The investigation and court trials are still ongoing as more evidence of the scandals comes to light. Ladies and gentlemen, the main malpractice in the One NDB scandal was embezzlement of an epic scale. It occurred in 4 phases and involved misappropriation of its funds, largely derived from borrowing through bond and sukuk issuance and bank loans. The misappropriation involved 6 major embezzlements. Next slide. One, you can see from the chart here, we simplified the phases that one NDB scandal. One is during the Good Star phase, which is for 2009 and 2011. In 2009, USD 700 million, or measuring it RN 2.93 billion of a cash grant of USD 1 billion by one NDB to a JV with PSI was siphoned off to be credited to an account of a company, Good Star Limited, which is owned by our friend Jolo. Secondly, in May 2011, an additional USD 330 million lent by one NDB to JV ended up as a deposit in the Good Star account. In 2012, during the ABA BVI phase, a USD 3.5 billion raised by one NDB in a bond issue in that year, approximately USD 1.4 billion was misappropriated, ending up in an account owned by the same person, Jolo. In 2013, during the Tano phase, more than USD 1.26 billion of USD 3.3 USD billion bond issue was embezzled for the benefit of Jolo, his associate and officials in one NDB. This is the period where an amount of USD 681 million dollars have been channeled from Tano to Najib's personal account, and in August, 30th of August, in the same year, 2013, 620 USD million has been transferred out back to Tano. Also in 2013, some of the loans to SRC International from the Civil Service Pension Fund, which was mentioned above, were reportedly embezzled to the benefit of an associate of Jolo, Eric Tan Kim Lu. The investigation revealed some of the funds were diverted locally to the accounts of Najib. In 2014, amount of USD 850 million were embezzled from a loan of USD 1.23 billion to one NDB, a syndicate of banks. This loan was to be used as a cash payment to IPIC in return for which it would act as a guarantor for one NDB debt. Again, the benefactors were Low and his associates. Bribery also transpired in the one NDB scandal. Bribes were offered by Goldman Sachs. Bribes were offered by Goldman Sachs to and accepted by officials in one NDB and the Malaysian government, and in return, Goldman Sachs was appointed to arrange and underwrite the bond issues in 2012 and 2013 for a very high underwriting fee, as mentioned above. In a crucial piece of evidence, Goldman Sachs chairman in Southeast Asia, Tim Lesner, pleaded guilty in a New York court in November 2018. Malaysia in the center for the investigation toward the corruption scandal of one NDB. As an effort to revive and strengthen the investigation, Malaysia has formed the one NDB task force. The task force comprised of the MACC, Attorney General Office, Royal Malaysian Police, and Bank Negara or Malaysian Central Bank. And its leading members are those who figured in the original task force, but who fell out of favor with the previous government. Given the international nature of the one NDB scandal, investigation have been and continued to be conducted in a number of countries under their respective anti-corruption and anti-money laundering laws, where financial institutions have been in receipt of illicit money from one NDB. The focus has been largely on money laundering, although other offenses such as bribery and supplying dishonest and misleading information are being investigated. In Singapore, money laundering by certain banks and individuals connected to 1MDB has been investigated since 2016. Detailed investigation has also been conducted in Switzerland by the Money Laundering Reporting Office Switzerland, MROS, the Office of Attorney General of Switzerland, OAGS, and the Swiss FINMA, Financial Market Supervisory Authority. The focus of the investigation, as in Singapore, is money laundering, given the large amount of embezzled money from 1MDB that passed through banks in Switzerland. In addition, the investigation into 1MDB corruption continued to be conducted in the USA. Where certain locally registered banks and their senior managers are being investigated for money laundering, bribery, and other offenses connected to 1MDB. The main anti-corruption agency involved in this task is the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, MLRAS, of the DOJ. In Malaysia, charges have been levied against several 1MDB officials. The former CEO of 1MDB, Arukanda, was charged in December 2018 with tampering with the audit report of 1MDB in 2016. From the slide shown here, you can see three main charges against Dato Najib Razak, where he was charged in 2018. 1MDB on corruption cases, 4 charges, 21 charges on money laundering, and secondly, on the case of SRC International, on 10 counts of a CBT, and also 2 counts of money laundering charges. In this case, where 42 million in SRC case, 42 million of money being transferred into his personal account. For the first case on 1MDB, the total of 2.28 billion of Malaysian ringgit, the money transferred into his personal account. It was a personal account specially created for him to channel the money. And lastly, the audit report is an abuse of power to prevent, where he asked one of his senior officials to tamper the evidence of the audit report to prevent him from any criminal charges. Next. You see, there are some charges here I can show you from in the slide. These are the charges against his wife, Rosmah binti Mansur, where Rosmah faced 17 charges on money laundering, which amount to 14.919 million ringgit, and secondly, charges on our Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act 2009 involving 2 million ringgit. Next. Next slide. These are some of the recipients we can go through. This is a lawyer of United Malaysian Organization. His name is Dato Farizam bin Harun, recipient of ringgit Malaysia of 15 million. 3 charges against him, where this 15 million was channeled to one person who used to be a media person expert for Najib Razak, namely Paul Statland. Next. And this is a former minister, Dato Ahmad bin Maslan, also receiving 2 million ringgit from Najib from his personal account. Next. This is Mr. Sharif Samad, also a politician, one of the recipients from the money from Najib Razak. Next. And this is Muhammad Shafi bin Abdullah, the counsel for Najib Razak, and he's also stand for his own trial, and he's a counsel for Najib in the case of 1MDB. Next. And this is Rizal Shari Aziz, the stepson of Najib Razak, and he's a famous guy who produced a film, namely The Wolf of Wall Street. And we have a settlement with Mr. Rizal Aziz, which we have firstly, we charged him on the 5 charges on money laundering, amounting to 248.17 million ringgit. And the settlement is between Malaysia authority and with the DOJ, whereby we need to withdraw all the charges to enable DOJ to forfeit amount of 170 million Malaysian ringgit from USD 117 million. So with that settlement, it's enabled DOJ to forfeit the amount of assets from Riza Sharis Aziz, where the asset was in US and also in UK. Next. This one of the conspirator, a co-conspirator, is a former CEO of 1MDB, and also one of guy, Tan Sri Muhammad Irwan Siriga, is a former Treasury Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of Finance, and both of them actually did not benefited any amount of money, but they are we say the conspirator for Najib Razak in abetting Najib Razak to bail out of him from the 1MDB scandal. Next. We charge 3% in absentia, namely Low Teck Chu, Tariq Azam Ahmad Obaid, and Patrick Andrew Mahoney. For Tariq Azam Ahmad Obaid and Patrick Andrew Mahoney, both of them are now in proposing some settlement with Malaysian authority. That's important part here in enforcement work is recovery of assets stolen from 1MDB and their return to Malaysia. So far, 20.4 billion has been recovered. Forfeiture claims are being made against 41 organizations and individuals. This is part of a long process to recover as much of the stolen funds as possible. Yes. You can see from the slide here. Next. A summary of assets have been recovered from various countries. In 2019, 1.15 billion Malaysian ringgit, and in 2020, 14.257 billion, and in 2021, 5.056 billion recovered from many countries and especially from the United States. You can see from the details here, and the total asset recovery 20.49 billion. Already have been recovered, and we hope that for the next year we're going to recover more. Next. These are the potential asset recovery that we try to bring back to Malaysia. One, asset recovery in Switzerland. Secondly, asset recovery in Singapore. Thirdly, asset recovery in UAE, and fourthly, asset recovery in Mauritius. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 4 reasons why the 1MDB scandal arose, as indicated below. Firstly, the internal controls over spending, lending, and investment in 1MDB were weak and reflected in a defective system of governance. Secondly, the attempts to deal with corruption in 1MDB were hamstrung by political control over the watchdog and investigative agencies. The Special Task Force formed in 2015 to uncover evidence of corruption was soon after sidelined and then abandoned after incriminating evidence against Najib emerged. Thirdly, the corruption was facilitated by weak internal rules against money laundering in banks in Malaysia and elsewhere, and even where such rules existed by their willingness not to adhere to these rules or to anti-money laundering laws. The fourth and most important reason was the lack of political will. With Najib as a Prime Minister and Chairman of 1MDB Advisory Board, and allegedly himself a beneficiary of the embezzlement, there was no political will at the top to deal with the corruption in 1MDB. Indeed, he's the one actually involved in the scandal. One consequence of the 1MDB scandal was to make the organization insolvent by 2016, which unable to keep key debt servicing payments. With so much money embezzled, the funds remaining for investment in many projects were insufficient to meet the interest payments on all of the borrowed funds. Subsequently, the Malaysian government stepped in to pay 6.98 Malaysian billion, which is approximately USD 1.66 billion in debt servicing payment in 2016 and 2017. The payments were made from cash generated by the sale of land by the Malaysian Central Bank, which is Bank Negara, and by the issue of shares of the sovereign wealth fund of the government of Malaysia, Khazanah Nasional Berhad. The second important consequence of the scandal was the erosion of public trust in both politicians and institutions of government. A survey of 1,000 persons in Malaysia conducted by Civil Society Group Center for a Better Tomorrow, back in February 2018, which is before the general election, discovered that only 16% expressed trust in Malaysian politicians and that only 29% expressed trust in the federal government. It is likely that the emerging evidence of the 1MDB scandal had significantly decreased the level of trust and in turn undermined support for Najib's government. The 1MDB scandal was a key issue in the campaign and certainly contributed to its defeat in 2018 general election. In response to 1MDB scandal, the new government unveiled in January 2019 a 5-year plan to clamp down on corruption government, which we call it National Anti-Corruption Plan, NACP, for 2019 to 2023. The plan launched by former Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir himself. It would entail major changes to the appointment process for key posts, require MPs and ministers to publicly declare their assets, and ensure new laws to regulate political funding and lobbying. This sounds promising and is intended to prevent another major corruption scandal, but it remains to be seen how vigorously the plan will be implemented in practice and whether it will be affected by political influences. For now, thank you so much.
Terima kasih banyak, Dato Sri Azam Baki. Terima kasih banyak atas sharingnya. Saya yakin.
Thank you, Dato. Thank you for that sharing. And I'm sure that our participants here are looking forward to discuss with you and about your experience during the investigation and prosecution of the case. We realized that it involved a lot of high-level individuals in the case, and I would assume that the political backlash was quite strong at that time. So we have noted a number of questions that we are going to discuss in our Q&A. But for now, let's hear from the prosecutor of KPK, Mr. Muhammad Asri Irwan. But I think we still has difficulty to access the forum because of internet access. So why don't we go ahead with Miss Sophie Shoot? Are you there?
Sophie, hello.
Sophie?
Yes, I'm here. Just a second. I wasn't. I'm here. I've been listening. I'm just switching on my camera now.
Okay. I'm sorry for the
No, I'm
sudden
ready.
notification.
Okay. Okay. So I'll go next while we're waiting for Makassar to reconnect.
Yes. Thank you, Sophie.
So yes, good afternoon. Selamat siang. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this webinar. I'm speaking to you from Bergen in Western Norway, where the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center is part of the Kristen Mikkelsen Institute for International Development. I was asked to speak about institutional and political aspects to combat corruption involving vast quantities of assets. And this is a very broad topic. So during the minutes that have been allotted to me, I will zoom in on just a few aspects that seem particularly pertinent, considering the current developments in Indonesia and the international guidance that is available, which, as mentioned before, has been among others initiated by Indonesia itself. So I will focus on the importance of integrity and independence of investigations and prosecutions and the people who are conducting them, and the institutional environment that is necessary for them to do their best job without fear for repercussions. Corruption involving vast quantities of assets means corruption on a big scale. And this typically means that A, several parties are involved, and B, that those parties are in a position that actually gives them access to vast quantities of assets. So usually positions higher up in government and other branches of the state. So the biggest scammers and perpetrators of large-scale corruption are typically among the most powerful in a country. And this is at the core of the challenges that law enforcement agencies face. Often under-resourced law enforcement agencies must build a case against those higher up in the food chain of the executive branch of the state. And in some countries, corruption has become so endemic that the law enforcement agencies themselves have been undermined and become part of the problem. The courts, at least in democracies, are independent of government as a means of checks and balances. But judges can only hear the cases that are brought before them. And if it is small fish that they are served, is it only small fish they can pass their verdict on? So to use another metaphor, if the criminal justice chain from detection, investigation to prosecution and adjudication is only as strong as its weakest link. Over the last 3 decades, we have seen the establishment of more than 100 specialized anti-corruption bodies and units worldwide. This mostly happened where the existing law enforcement agencies were deemed not being efficient, capable, or willing enough to go after the cases involving vast amounts of assets. In practice, challenges with efficiency, integrity, capacity, and eagerness are often interlinked. Inefficiencies are created deliberately in order to extort victims and defendants alike. Files can be lost for a fee. Poorly run agencies often do not attract the brightest and most capable recruits. Especially where willingness and or integrity is a problem, independent, and I'm emphasizing here independent, anti-corruption commissions have often been seen as a last resort, or at the same time criticized as window dressing. Because what does independence actually mean for an investigating and in some cases also prosecuting body? Some commissions bear independence in their name, such as the ICAC in Hong Kong, the Independent Commission Against Corruption. But what does it imply and require in practice? Independence clearly requires more than just a new body and a new office. In 2012, I was actually privileged to be invited to that event that Francesco referred to earlier. It was in Jakarta. It was hosted by the United Nations, by UNODC and UNDP and the KPK. It was a conference that brought together several heads of anti-corruption commissions and regional associations of anti-corruption authorities to discuss what makes anti-corruption agencies independent and effective. And this conference resulted in the Jakarta Statement on Principles for Anti-Corruption Agencies. I think the link has been posted in the chat already. And this has since become a reference point for anti-corruption agencies worldwide. Indonesia can be proud of not only having initiated and hosted the Jakarta Statement, but also for being home to one of the few agencies that fully complies with the 12 principles. Actually, I should say complied in the past tense, because by the looks of it, it is questionable whether it still does. One key principle, for example, principle number 10, out of the 12 principles is that anti-corruption agencies shall have the power to recruit and dismiss their own staff according to internal, clear, and transparent procedures. And 16, 17 years ago, the first leadership of KPK set the foundation for an honest and performance-oriented organization by insisting on having autonomy over KPK's human resources. KPK's autonomy in managing its own officers, the Pegawai KPK, has allowed it to shield itself against the malpractices and distortive incentives that still inflict the general civil service system. And it is not the level of the KPK salaries that insulates against temptation. It is its simple and transparent structure and performance orientation, and a rigorous recruitment process, internal monitoring, and an office culture that holds integrity high. This human resource system laid the foundation for KPK's success in investigating large-scale corruption cases involving very senior government officials and legislators. Then we know that in September 2019, a new law rather suddenly changed KPK's special position by making it part of the executive family and the state apparatus. And then last year, 2020, the government regulation to integrate KPK staff into the civil service was enacted. And by putting the KPK officers under the civil service umbrella, a lot of the previous autonomy is being taken away from KPK. About the same time this happened, this is coincidental, the Colombo commentary to the Jakarta Statement on the Principles for the Independence of Anti-Corruption Agencies was published. It contains good practice examples for each of the principles and a checklist from a number of good examples from a number of different jurisdictions worldwide and a checklist. And for the principle number 10 on the authority of human resources, there are 3 checklist questions that are being asked. The first question is, does the anti-corruption agency have the power to recruit and dismiss its own staff? Second questions, are laws, rules, policies, and are procedures in place that clearly set out a transparent, merit-based process for recruiting staff? And the third question, are laws, rules, policies, and are procedures in place that clearly set out the process for disciplining and dismissing staff? As I said, all KPK staff, including those who have been seconded from other institutions, have undergone a competitive, multi-tiered recruitment process that includes integrity testing by an external human resource consultancy. So in the past, KPK ticked all the boxes on human resource autonomy, and it was sometimes envied for that by its international peers, by other anti-corruption agencies out there. Now we know that the transfer of KPK staff into the civil service has to be concluded by September this year. And this could, of course, still be clear and transparent. But it is very unfortunate to see this transfer process is now being used as an ideology test at best, or at worst, an intransparent attempt to dismiss some of the most experienced investigators and other staff in strategic positions, such as the head of the Human Resources Bureau. A while ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a workshop with renowned international investigators and prosecutors discussing common problems in bringing large-scale corruption cases to court. We discussed possible bias of the courts, delays, and threats and ways to deal with them. And a summary of the analysis and the recommendations can still be found on our website, on the EU webpage, under Managing a Hostile Court Environment. One important takeaway from these discussions is that investigating and prosecuting corruption is a tough job. It puts limits on the private and social life of law enforcers. They cannot just mingle as the rest of us. They have to avoid bias and conflicts of interest. They always have to be on their best behavior so as to not make themselves vulnerable to blackmail. And still they may receive overt or direct threats. Ideally, they are part of an institution that addresses some of these risks, that provides ethical guidance and legal and physical protection. In practice, some of these risks can come from within the institutions, especially when the senior leadership is not sufficiently insulated from politics. Unfortunately, the KPK is not the only anti-corruption commission experiencing serious pushback. Those investigating, prosecuting, adjudicating corruption involving vast quantities of assets are likely to face considerable resistance the moment they do their job well. It is therefore extremely important to continue building and maintaining alliances among anti-corruption actors worldwide, among the law enforcement agencies, and including the anti-corruption commissions, but also other accountability institutions and non-governmental organizations. In the past, the international community has discussed and negotiated at length the necessary measures to reduce corruption worldwide. And most recently, as part of the political declaration to the UNGAS in June in New York. And in this declaration, states recognize the role of anti-corruption bodies and specialized authorities in implementing and monitoring the policies and practices, and promise to grant them the necessary independence in accordance with the fundamental principles of domestic law to enable them to carry out their functions effectively and free from undue influence with integrity and accountability. And the state parties pledged to strengthen their capacity and provide them with necessary resources to carry out their oversight functions and to facilitate strong cooperation among them at all levels. Now, anti-corruption commissions come in different colors and shapes, and some countries don't even have them. They have as part of their regular law enforcement bodies. With anti-corruption commissions, some only have preventive functions. Others, like KPK, have the full set of enforcement authorities. Some anti-corruption agencies only have 50 staff, some more than 1,000. And this makes it difficult to find a common denominator when it comes to standards and their compliance measurement. But it's not impossible. The Jakarta statement and the Colombo commentary have been a first step, but it could be taken further, and perhaps following the steps or the example of human rights commissions and their accreditation, or downgrading by the UN Human Rights Council if institutional frameworks no longer meet certain standards. Additionally, the assignment of a special UN rapporteur on corruption might give the international community a focal point and voice to speak out on corruption cases and corruption fighters in need. In the meantime, we should not shy away from speaking out in support of those whose daily and not particularly well paid work is to investigate the misuse of vast amounts of assets and retrieving those assets to the state and the common good. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak, Sophie, atas paparannya.
Thank you, Sophie, for that presentation and that insights. And UNODC accommodates different perspectives in this discussion. And we hope that at the end of this discussion, we can connect the dots, we can bridge between these different perspectives on different aspects about this issue. So thank you so much, Sophie. And for sure, we're going to have a Q&A after all of presentations are delivered. So I would like to again call Mr. Muhammad Asri Irwan. Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. Apologies that I've just joined you, but please, I will not be able to activate my camera because it's going to eat up too much of my bandwidth. So I apologize for that. I really apologize that I'm not able to show my face to the audience. This is a very good platform, but however, I have to prioritize my connection stability. So, Mr. Irwan, the floor is yours. Thank you, Putri. Thank you, UNODC, for the opportunity. I represent KPK, the Anti-Corruption Agency of Indonesia. Good afternoon, everyone. So today UNODC asked us to tell you about the challenges and lessons learned in connection to the theme that we have today. In KPK, I'm part of the Department of Enforcement. I'm a prosecutor, and I would like to share more experience and challenges in combating corruption involving vast quantities of assets. So in handling corruption involving vast quantities of assets in KPK, we have had several cases that are quite challenging. And when it comes to vast quantities of assets, it's connected to money laundering as well. There are a number of interesting cases that I would like to highlight in this opportunity. So on the presentation that I have shared earlier with Putri, it's more of a theoretical presentation, but I would like to share with you more about some interesting cases and historical cases for KPK. One is a case involved an individual named Nasaruddin, and he was a treasurer of the Democratic Party, the ruling party of Indonesia at the time. So he was the treasurer of the party, and he's also a member of the parliament. He's one of the MPs in the national parliament. And KPK is proud of the work that it's done because we recovered up of around 600 billion of assets. And we were able to prosecute the case. So what were the challenges from the perspective of a prosecutor? I have number of points that I have prepared, and I'm hoping to share with the webinar participants as well as the other panelists here. So of the 600 billion of assets that we recovered internally, the internal challenges from within KPK mainly was on coordination with the investigators, as well as, for example, the Asset Tracing Bureau. We have to work on to have more effective coordination. It took us around 4 years working on the case, and one of the things that we recognized as the main challenge was in working or coordinating with other parties or other officers in this case. We identified PICs for this case, and we're thankful that we're able to close the case. In Indonesia, before we go to the prosecution, we have what we call as pre-trial. And we took us around 1 year before we could have a complete dossier and we can start with court proceedings. As you can see on my slide, this slide tells us about the typology of money laundering. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, what I would like to share with you is more on the real challenges when we worked on some of these cases. So I have mentioned the internal challenge, the coordination with different departments. The second challenge is in investigating money laundering involving this individual Nasaruddin. I have to be frank that we were not looking at a conventional case. In a regular case of money laundering, for example, the case that involved Joko Susilo or the case that involved Lutfi Hasan Iskak or Waode, the way that they store their assets were more
being placed with their mistress, their children, their relatives, their nephews, nieces, and for instance, like cars under their relative's name, children's name, or nieces or nephew's name. So indeed, this case that we are going to present is not the conventional case. Why so? Because the defendant, Nasaruddin, bought some equity, retail, bonds, and others. And most, or the newest one, the defendant involved gatekeepers, and he also placed his money in different corporations, and we found many gatekeepers, many corporations, including investors in Singapore, Garrett Lim and Mr. Garrett Lim and Mr. Lim Kim Sang. So this is one of the example displayed in our slide, how our colleagues in our team conducted assets profiling. In KPK, we have a special unit called Assets Tracing Unit. For Nasaruddin case, we produce his profile, his family profile, and then after that, we communicate with the citizenship department or agency, and in order to identify his companies, we contact the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, and in order to identify his land assets, we coordinate with the National Land Agency, and for his cars and other vehicles, we coordinate with the Indonesian National Police Registration Vehicle Register. Hello?
Pak, masih tersambung, Pak? Ya.
Yeah, you are still connected. We can still hear you. And then another challenge in this case was because the defendant is not in the organizational structure of the companies. So this presented a major challenge for us as investigators to reveal who is Nasaruddin. But we were lucky because at that time, we had individuals named as the directors and presidents of those companies, and they are related to Nasaruddin. And in this case, the assets were placed and concealed abroad. And for Nasaruddin, he actually brought the assets to Singapore. So we had to cooperate with the Singapore Anti-Corruption Commission. And based on that cooperation, we managed to identify a small percentage. Yes, we had to admit this is a small percentage, not maximum, a tugboat under Nasaruddin's name. So this is remaining as a homework for KPK. We are still working with Singapore CPID to investigate Mr. Lim King Sang and Mr. Garrett Lim, because we want to make sure that that they are really the gatekeepers, working as gatekeepers for Nasaruddin. But one interesting thing for us, when Nasaruddin used these gatekeepers as prosecutors, we understand that when Nasaruddin was arrested in 2012, the gatekeepers immediately cut all contacts. That's why it is quite difficult for us to obtain evidence. So when we investigate or question Nasaruddin, Nasaruddin asked us to identify and go after the gatekeepers. But it is quite difficult because when the gatekeepers learned that Nasaruddin was arrested, they cut all contact and communication with Nasaruddin, and they now work independently on their own. So this is among the challenges that we experience. And in this assets concealment, we also face another difficulty when it comes to the equity, overseas equity, because we have to identify the who is the broker, what are the equity and others. And for us, I think, to equip us, one of the lessons learned from this case, investigators and prosecutors need to have other knowledge or other skills, not only on how to prosecute corruption case, but also we need to learn about stock market and other banking related knowledge. Another difficult part or another difficulty that we faced is to detect the flow of fund when we have cash withdrawal. This is actually difficult to detect. Whenever they have cash withdrawal, we don't know what the money is then used for. One other interesting fact is out of the 500 billion rupiah, around 500 to 600 billion rupiah, we managed to confiscate a palm oil factory in Riau. And when we wanted to confiscate that factory, we had difficulty because we also have to pay attention to the welfare of the workers. We don't want the workers to lose their jobs and lose their income and livelihood. So we forfeited the factory, but in reality, when we want to sell the factory, we have to sell the company together with the management. So if other company want to buy the factory, they have to buy the factory together with all its operations, including all the workers. Which means that the workers still have to be employed by any company or individuals that take over this factory, this oil palm mill. Thank you, Mbak Putri. Thank you, Pak Asri. Thank you very much for sharing your experience in the investigation and prosecution of corruption, which involve vast quantity of assets. From the presentation, we learned that there are a big number of assets, proceeds of crimes that you managed to forfeit. So there are many questions on this case. I am going to compile all of the questions, and we will have the question and answer session at the end of the session. Next, I'm going to say hello to Bu Fitri Susanti. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. So without further ado, I would like to invite you to share from the point of view of civil society on corruption involving vast quantity of assets.
I think I would like to present my presentation in English. As requested, I will be talking about the response of the civil society to the current situation of the KPK in Indonesia. I have prepared very simple presentation just to make my points clearer. So my presentation focuses on the reflection on Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK. Sophie also talked about that previous. In terms of large-scale corruption, of course, Indonesia as our topic today, but I'm going to zoom out rather than talking about specific cases like what have been really well presented by KPK Prosecutor just now. But I'm going to zoom out to see the KPK in the country's context currently. To basically, I would like to ask all of the panelists as well as participants to look back at the Oslo statement and also reflect on the statement. How much is that true and how much is that proven in the case of Indonesia? But more importantly, actually, I would like to use this opportunity. Thank you to UNODC who already invited me to this important discussion, to also call the international community to act upon what's going on in Indonesia at this moment to prevent this to going further down, I would say. Why I'm talking about going further down, that's what I'm going to present. So I believe because all of the panelists are the experts and most of them already joined the Jakarta meeting several years ago. So many of you are quite familiar with the Indonesian KPK. So I won't talk much about that from the very, very beginning, but just to refresh probably your memory that the KPK was established under the law number 30 of 2002. So it was established in 2002, but there were also amendments to the law. The first one was 2015, and then the last one, Sophie also already mentioned that and addressed that issue in 2019. So regarding the preventing large-scale corruption, the KPK have assigned investigators from the police and independent investigators of KPK, and then prosecutors assigned from the Attorney General's office, And Indonesia also has special court on anti-corruption under the Court of General Jurisdiction, but with special procedures, and judges undergoing special recruitment process, allowing non-career judges. So in theory, it's independent judges, but then again, we have to see how is it in reality, especially now. And then there was no authority to issue warrant for termination of investigation. Most of the important powers were withdrawn in 2019. Before I go to the current situation, because as I said before, I want to zoom out to see the whole context, because this is, I think, what both Oslo Statement and also Jakarta Charter talk about, the need of the independent investigators, prosecutors, and judges. I would like to see it in terms of the independent commission, such as the Indonesia's KPK, because what I'm going to show in my presentation is how the independent commission, such as KPK, because it was too effective, they got attacked by political actors who are not happy about, that they are blocked by the KPK. So just briefly, because again, I'm sure in various occasions you already discussed this, but let me just put everything in one table and then try to wrap it up and reflect on them. First one, probably we all remember about the 2009 Gecko versus Crocodile. Named Commander General Police Susno Duaji as a grave suspect. And not long after that, after the announcement about the suspect status of the police general, the police named 2 KPK commissioners as grave suspects too. And even more dramatic, the police also arrested KPK chief at that time, Antasari Azhar, for murder. Yeah, and he is now free. He already underwent his punishment in jail, and already spoke up about what went on at that time. And then let me highlight in that moment, because this is also an important aspect to the story of Indonesia. At that moment in 2009, the civil society defended KPK full strength, I would say. Yeah, at that time, excuse me, at that time we had demonstrations, we went to the street, and then at that time, Facebook was very popular in Indonesia, not yet other social media, no Twitter yet. So at that time, there was also the civil society mobilized support on Facebook. So it's basically everyone, musicians, artists, and every part of the society basically defended KPK at that time. And then the second one, so we call this Gecko versus Crocodile 2.0. It was 2012. Again, not long after the KPK named a police general as a suspect in the vast quantity corruption involving vast quantity of asset, the police many of them went to the KPK building at that time to arrest KPK investigator Novel Baswedan for allegedly shooting robbery suspect in 2004. So very old cases, and it was very debatable. But anyhow, they went there. So there was again very big defense from the civil society at that time that protect the KPK building as a symbol to protect the KPK. And then the third one, 2015, there was again involving KPK again announced Police General Budi Gunawan, but it was even in a worse situation than the previous ones, because at that time he was the only candidate from President Joko Widodo for the Indonesia's National Police Chief. So that was pretty big shock at that time for Indonesia. And then just few days later, the police arrested one of KPK commissioners, Bambang Wijoyanto, and then also targeted another KPK commissioner, Adnan Pandu Praja. And then also later on, February 2015, Abraham Samad, the KPK chief, was also targeted, but the cases, not all of the cases actually went on. And then we also have to see the statistics. I only managed to find the Bahasa Indonesia version of the statistic, but I just want to quickly show you, because they're also very small in terms of the numbers, why KPK is, I believe, seen as the intruder for the corruptors to conduct their corrupt practices. Because apparently, as you can see, the blue one, or probably I should start with the highest one in 2018. The orange one is the provincial government. So it's the highest cases handled by the KPK. And then in the ministry and agency is the blue one. So it's the second highest. So it is pretty effective. So let me also show you another fact again, because in the Oslo Statement and also in the Jakarta Charter, we talk about the need of protecting investigators, prosecutors, judges, and here we can really see, for example, Novel Baswedan, who in 2015 was also chased by the police because of his previous work. He used to be the police investigator, but then he opted to be the KPK independent investigator and moved basically to KPK. So he was attacked. He got acid attack, and you can see in his left eye. He's now, if I'm not mistaken, his left eye is totally blind now, but the right eye, he can see probably like 20% or something like that. But that was real. It was an acid attack to an investigator, and he indeed handled big corruption cases involving big quantity of assets. And it didn't stop there. Two KPK, as you can see on the right-hand side of my presentation, it's just a short article from the media that two KPK commissioners get bomb threats in their residences. And there were also other stories how the laptop of another KPK staff that had so much data regarding a big corruption case got stolen when she was outside the building. I mean, there were also other occasions such as occasions like that, just to give you, the threats to those dealing with big scale corruption cases in Indonesia. So, so most importantly is now my reflection. Or no, this is before the reflection. I'm now going to talk about what Sophie already mentioned before, but after I talk about the previous attacks, now I would like to put you in the context of the current situation, where in 2019, I believe, because let me just use the word they here. Yeah, we can point out, to the oligarchs or to the politicians who don't like to be prevented for stealing the people's money, or just use the word they. they, I believe that they learned from the previous strikes to the KPK that just attacking the KPK commissioners with bomb or with acid attack or going to the marching to the KPK building in 2019 would not work that well. Without, first of all, the civil society has to be weakened, because the civil society has been the biggest defender of the KPK in 2009, 2012, 2015, and then 2017. Also, there was an attempt to change the law, but then it was the civil society managed to stop the process at that time. But 2019, it was conducted in the behind closed doors. Nobody really knew about that until the last, I think, 2 or 1 day before it was decided by the executive and the legislator. So there it was, amendment to the KPK law, stripping the independence by effectively put the KPK under the executive. Sophie mentioned this before. And this is done by effectively by putting the staff of the KPK, who used to be independent staff of the KPK, now they are put under the executive, meaning they can be controlled in terms of doing their investigation, probably not, later on prosecution and all that. And then secondly, again, weakening the civil society, by portraying the KPK as the Islamist organization. So there were rumors spreading about about the fact that many KPK staff, they show the look of the Taliban, so they say. So many of the civil society who used to defend KPK believe that story, and they stopped defending KPK, saying that, look, Islamist situation is really worse than having corruption in Indonesia. So we just have to let KPK being put under the executive, so the executive can control the KPK, so they can prevent the KPK to, spread the idea of Talibanism. That's basically the story that went around at that time. And then in 2020, there was a big reselection of the KPK staff, in which 75 staff who handled big cases involving vast quantities of assets were dismissed. And not to mention, that was also happened. That is actually happening also because of the selection of the commissioners, also in 2019, where one of the commissioners who got elected actually had very bad track record in terms of corruption eradication. So my reflection to our discussion today, again, I will zoom out a little bit and not only look at the individual cases, but I would like to point out that as the expert group meetings have identified, preventing and combating corruption involving vast quantities of assets require independent investigators, prosecutors, and judges. These considerations were actually included when the KPK was designed. I happened to be in the design team in 1999 to 2002, and at that time we talk about it a lot because there were many lawyers in that team, and we understand that this is what we need to have in the new KPK at that time to be able to successfully eradicate corruption. And they did work too well. So the oligarchs strike back, directly targeting the investigators and commissioners of KPK apparently did not work well. So the target then is the KPK as an institution through its law and its institutional design. That's one. And then the civil society also needed to be weakened. So the support is not as significant as in previous attacks. So in my own experience, anecdotal of course, but this is a valid experience that in the civil society groups at this time, it's really interesting to see how our comrades, colleagues, friends who defended KPK in 2009, 2012, 2015 are now, sit across of where we, the civil society defending KPK, sit. And unfortunately, I would say that President Jokowi also does not provide support to KPK as promised during his campaign. If we compare the response of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono to KPK and the response of President Joko Widodo to KPK when the KPK was attacked, they are very different. We can talk about this later on, but I just would like to point that out to again reflect on the Oslo statement, and then probably we can learn from the case of Indonesia on how to really call the governments involving in this issue to really work on the preventing and combating corruption involving vast quantities of assets. I stop here so we can have more discussion later on. Thank you, Putri. Good afternoon, everyone.
Terima kasih banyak Mbak Bibip, sangat concise paparannya.
Thank you, Ibu Bivitri, very concise, and thank you for keeping with the time allocated to you. So thank you for sharing the experience from the civil society on corruption, eradication of corruption involving vast quantities of assets. So we are now moving on to the Q&A session. I'm aware there have been so many questions raised in the chat box, but I would like to remind our participants to use the Q&A feature. I see around 30 questions in the Q&A box, and I have grouped the questions because some of them are similar or overlapping. So for our panelists, I have provided the English questions of the questions in the chat box.
That are actually included all questions. And I try to categorize the questions. Hopefully that would be helpful for you. So I'm going to the first questions. I mean, the first category is about the independence of the anti-corruption agencies and or the investigators, and the second category falls on the anti-corruption during the pandemic, and then about the asset recovery in combating corruption in vast quantities of asset. I think each of panelists, I will read all the questions, and I will give time for each panelist to answer the questions that are relevant for them. So I will read each questions, and all panelists, you could see my chat through chat a message from me. So the first question is, saya dalam bahasa Indonesia aja karena mungkin nanti panelis sudah membaca dalam bahasa Inggris. Pertama adalah mengenai independensi.
So the first group of questions about independence, first of all, is what is the concept of independence for an anti-corruption agency, and what is the best practice to implement this concept of independence? The second question is, how did the MACC adopt the South Korean model on corruption investigation officers, Office for High-Ranking Officials, or CIO, that allows you to handle corruption cases that involve the president, the ministers, members of the parliament, and people in your law enforcement agencies. According to this question, MACC was only able to charge a former prime minister, but not a sitting prime minister. Next question, also to the MACC. How does the MCC fight corruption without being influenced by the ruling politics or government? I think this question is also relevant for KPK. So for this group of questions, I would like to give the first floor to Francesco, and then we'll continue with Dato Asri, Azam, Baki. And then we go to Pak Muhammad, Asri, Irwan, and then we go to Sophie, and finally to Ibu Bivitri. Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you, Putri. The question of independence, honestly, has been debated in many forms for many years. I think the first point here is that, when it comes to corruption, we have to talk about, how cases are investigated, then prosecuted and adjudicated. So in my opinion, you can have an independent anti-corruption authority that investigates, but if you don't have an independent judiciary and independent prosecutorial services, you're not going to achieve much. So we have to also broaden a little bit the perspective and talk about the systemic independence in the criminal justice system overall. Let's not also forget that in many cases, anti-corruption authority have to rely on the police, on other, on customs, on other law enforcement authorities to initiate cases or conduct cases. So in my view, this whole issue of the independence of anti-corruption authority, and many disagree with me. I think that it has been, in a way, overemphasized a bit too much in comparison to what we have to look at in terms of the overall criminal justice system to make really things work. Now, going to the specificities of anti-corruption authority, okay, if you read the Jakarta statements, you have, the various elements of independence. You have the mandate, the clear mandate based on the law. You have, the power to investigate, use, freeze bank accounts, so, utilize special investigative techniques and so on. And of course, the issue of resources that are extremely important, both human and financial, they have to be there. That's absolutely true. But the point here is that no agency operates in a vacuum. No agency is completely independent. There must be a balance between independence and accountability as well. So how the system of independence and accountability is structured is very critical, and it's very contextual. It depends on the context. Now, there are some indications. For instance, one of the most important issues here is that the anti-corruption authorities are, as any other authority, hierarchical. So the leadership of the anti-corruption authority matters enormously. So if the leadership is independent, in the sense of how this leadership is selected, if the selection process is clear and transparent, and the tenure is ensured, and also if the leaders, the way in which the leaders can be dismissed is also in accordance to, very strict procedures, probably involving maybe the parliament or involving broader consultations rather than being decided in small circles among, within the executives, for instance. That's extremely, extremely important, because in the end, the investigators, and in the case of KPK, also the prosecutor, will have to report to their leaders, and in the end are the commissioners and the leaders of the organization that decides if the case goes ahead or not. So it is important, very important, to look at this, at the elements that ensure that the leaders are independent and can, make decision independently, in particular, of course, from the executive. And these are, main elements of the Jakarta Principles as well. But again, it's a very complex, very contextual and broader issues than just anti-corruption agencies, in my view.
Terima kasih Francesco atas penjelasannya.
Thank you, Francesco, for that answer. And so I want to move on to Dato Sri Azam.
I may say on Malaysian experience, you know, that before we became one commission as a commission in 2009, anti-corruption agencies of Malaysia, we've been established in 1967. We've gone through a kind of a process in terms of transformation of law and so forth. We thought at that time, or even our government at that time thought that by having such law embedded to anti-corruption agency at that time, it's shown that we are independent in our action and everything. We have that belief, but in the end, it seemed that the corruption issues in Malaysia has not been tackled very well until and then when the previous government in 2008 they lost about 6 states in the general election. At that time, it had become a kind of a shock to the government, and due to that, MACC was established in 2009, and we've been given a kind of a very strong and powerful laws to investigate corruption cases in Malaysia, and even MACC has to be seen independent. We've been overseen by 5 panels in terms of our activities. One of the main one is with the advisory board panels, where they will advise us on the policies and so forth. Even we have one of the we call it parliamentary panels to advise the Prime Minister on as to how that MACC should be seen more independence in future and in terms of their budget. And we have also one panel to review cases where where MACC or public prosecutor advise to close the case. And these are the things, the elements that where we should show that independence of the agencies, not only having a law or having a kind of a legislative to fight corruption, but the administrators or the government of the day need to show their political will as to how that these agencies like anti-graft agency like MACC or any anti-graft agency in their in the country's perspective to be seen independent. For MACC, I think we have kind of a very kind of a very bad experience in 2015, where the unveil of the scandal of 1MDB that shown where the prime ministers and the current government at the time, they interfere so much in our investigation, and due to that, the government which have we have governed the country for more than 60 years, they lost in the general election. That is kind of a lesson learned for the politician. And after that, until now, it seems that the politician now is a bit okay when whatever activities proposed by MACC it looks that they will support it. 2 things that the recent government had agreed, where the cabinet agreed to give MACC a bit more independence. One of it is to give MACC our own service commission, and also the security of tenure of the chief commissioner, whereby government agreed, the cabinet agreed, the appointment of the chief commissioner will be under constitution. So these are the things, the elements that I think for Malaysia people, they are looking forward as to how that the political wish can show their kind of their will to make this agency more independent.
Terima kasih Dato Sri Azam.
Thank you, Dato Sri Azam.
Mungkin Pak Asri.
So to Pak Asri.
Yeah, hello.
Ya,
Hello.
Yes, I'm still here.
mendengarkan dari Malaysia mengenai
Asri, I believe you've heard about the independence response from MACC. Could you share us your perspective, sir?
Iya,
mengenai
makasih Mbak Putri ya. Saya juga bersemangat mendengar.
Thank you, Putri. I'll follow closely the presentation from the other panelists, including Ibu Bivitri. And I've also listened to the perspective of Dato Sri about the independence of MACC.
Ya, pertanyaannya Pak,
Yes,
bagaimana?
so the question, Pak Asri, is about the independence of KPK, your investigators and your prosecutors, and how do they maintain their independence in working on a corruption case?
Saya pikir kita semua harus sepakat
Thank you. So I think we have to agree that law enforcement process has to be independent in the first place. Means that they're able to make decisions without undue influence.
kurang lebih 7 tahun di
I have
KPK.
spent around 7 years in KPK, and we feel that with the independence of the institution today, that independence needs to be maintained, and we also need to pay more attention on code of conduct and code of ethics.
Ya, termasuk dalam bagaimana supaya
It's
bisa
important to make sure that, for example, our human resource during recruitment or staff selection, we need to ensure transparency, which will lead to KPK's independence. And even though we're part of the prosecutorial service, but in KPK, we feel that everything, every element of our work has been very transparent. We always involve other teams, and we're very open with them. We also, for example, when we report to our leadership, we're very open in exchanging information, and we believe that the KPK is fostering that level of independence. Thank you, Pak Asri. Sophie, can we go to you?
Hello.
Yes, I've talked about this a lot already, and I just wanted to say that I very much agree with Francesco that, of course, we cannot. I mean, and I mentioned this. We need to think of the criminal justice system as a chain of institutions, and we need all of them to work well. And with anti-corruption commissions and especially the powerful ones like KPK, the attempt has been to put it all in one body and then insulate it. But then, of course, that attracts the interest or the disinterest of those whose interests are stepped on. And this is why KPK has been facing the brunt of these attacks in various forms. And so I think, yes, we cannot just rely or attempt to create these super bodies, but if we have something that works quite well, then we should all try and support it. But I also see this is a joint responsibility. And just because you have an anti-corruption commission doesn't mean that the rest of us can just go about business as usual. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But then if we create something that actually follows best practice, then we should try and protect that as well and speak up for it.
Terima kasih banyak, Sophie. Mbak Bivit.
Thank you, Sophie. So now I go to Bivitri. Same question about independence. I think it's a very interesting question to comment.
Halo, Mbak Bivitri.
Is Ibu Bivitri there?
Halo,
I think perhaps there's a connection trouble. That's okay. So once she's reconnected, she can offer her response about the next theme of question, and that is the corruption in during the pandemic. I'm going to read out some of the questions. We have one question not about the pandemic, but the concern behind this question resonates with me. The question is, what are the best practices according to the UNODC or from the experience of our panelists on how we can combat and corruption that we cannot handle on our own in our national jurisdiction? Can we bring the case to international court? So I realize that this is a question that is not related to the pandemic, but I share her concern. I think this is relevant to the impunity. But please hold on to your responses, because the next question is, what are the main challenges of the Indonesian government in eradicating corruption? It seems that corruption remains as a big problem, a major problem in Indonesia. And in connection to the COVID-19 pandemic, what is the corruption trend? Perhaps the methods of corruption that identified during the pandemic? Is there lessons learned from other countries? And what is the contribution from UNODC for the member state countries in eradicating corruption, especially in this pandemic situation? And the next question is, in your opinion, what is the root cause of corruption? Why is this happening? Is it because a weak legal framework, or bad personality of the culprits, that they don't have the ethics, they're not accountable, etc.? So let's go with the same order. So I give the first floor to Francesco, and then moving on with the other panelists, Dato Sri, and then Pak Asri, Ibu Sofi, and then Ibu Bivitri. While we're waiting Ibu Bivitri to reconnect with the webinar. Thank you. Let's start with Francesco.
Thank you, Putri. I think, okay, these questions are very broad. It's a bit difficult to answer comprehensively. First of all, on the challenges for Indonesia, very briefly, I'm going back to the point that I made before. Indonesia is a country of 260 million people. KPK has what? A few thousand employees. Thousands investigators at best. So in a country like that, obviously an agency like KPK can take care of a very small chunk of corruption and be very specific high-level cases. I think that in my modest opinion, the big challenge here is to create a system that engages institutions both at the central and local level. Let's not forget about how decentralized the country is. So engage institutions at the local level seriously in the fight against corruption. So if you have a few thousand people in KPK, you have hundreds of thousands of police officers across the country. Without, very serious integrity system, ethics, mechanisms for reporting corruption, whistleblowing, involving the various police forces, which are, the main chunk of the law enforcement authorities in the country, in my opinion, is going to be difficult anyhow to tackle the problem. So, to fit short, in a whole comprehensive approach that involves not only KPK, but also all the other law enforcement authorities and the local authorities would be very, very important. I think I want to just pick up briefly on, are we talking about COVID-19 now or later?
Now.
Now, okay. I mean, on the COVID-19, of course, it has been problematic issues because the countries, not only in the region, but everywhere in the world, they have increased their budgets dramatically with extra budgetary resources in a very rapid way. So obviously you have a situation where the accounting standards and the oversight on this spending had to be in a way simplified, simply because of the resources that, accounting, anti-corruption authorities, oversight mechanisms don't have the resources to oversee all these transactions that are taking place for addressing the pandemic, with all this amount of these billions of dollars that are being spent rapidly, especially on health, protective equipments, and even on distribution of funds to small and medium-sized enterprises which are in trouble. And that has been the main problem, and the corruption risks, the loopholes are obviously have become very, very big. I know KPK has made an effort to put together, a monitoring mechanisms, which is very interesting. Other agencies in this region have done the same, but generally speaking, when it comes to this kind of packages, they have been introduced without not that much consultation with anti-corruption authorities, and quite strongly and directly by the executive, giving to the executive in many instances also power to implement which go beyond the normal state of affairs, with procurements, direct procurements in many instances, direct contracting, for procuring these or that goods, or for the health sector and so on. So a big issue. I think the countries are starting to understand now. They are introducing little by little oversight mechanisms that are more effective. But obviously, and there have been already also a couple of cases in Indonesia, including high level on distribution of COVID-19 relief, corruption in the distribution of COVID-19 relief efforts. So it is a big problem. I'll stop here for now to let the other speakers also have a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. And Dato Sri Azam.
Yeah, thank you. If I may, that I'm not really keen so much to comment on Indonesia problem, but if I may say something that we can look at how that history has shown where people will come back to the reality when times come, as what we we experience in Malaysia, and what we can say that whatever the politicians do now, they are creating some bad history, and the public will teach them a lesson in future. So what I can say here to KPK, be strong, that we have to be patient, and times will come where the integrity will be put in place again. Secondly, on COVID-19 issues, and what I can see, it happened in many countries where packages package given to public at large, and to manage the SMEs economy and everything. What we here in Malaysia do now, firstly, we monitor the procurement issues that government has allowed many procurement in terms of buying medical equipment and so forth through direct negotiations. This is something that's not a good practice, but anyway, that if government follow the strict rules on open tender, then the service delivery to the public will be a bit delayed. So in this case, one of the recommendation given by us and agreed by government is to introduce integrity pact. Integrity pact that the company who involved in procurement, they need to declare some of the things of the they were not involved in any corrupt activities or any criminals. Secondly, it is the government will introduce in the integrity pact the beneficial ownership to the company, whereby only a company who has who is very competent in supplying supplying the goods and medical equipment will be given the project. And other things is we keep on monitoring the public officials misconduct, and we're going to introduce a new law to government, and it's all in pipeline.
Terima kasih banyak, Dato. Memang kita
Thank you very much, Dato. In the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, indeed, we need to give quick response, which of course, at times can open opportunities for corruption. But I believe that all governments, including Malaysian and Indonesian government, have taken some mitigation efforts. Now we can continue with Pak Asri. Pak Asri. Yeah, hello. Hello, Mbak Putri, thank you. Please, sir, please.
Terima kasih ya.
Thank you.
Jadi
So,
pada prinsipnya tentang bagaimana
in principle,
upaya untuk menekan
when it comes to efforts to mitigate corruption, we have agreed, actually I agree with Mr. Francesco, Dato Sri, and other presenters, other resource persons, that corruption eradication is not the domain of KPK alone in Indonesia. Indeed, we need to have synergy among all law enforcement agencies, the Indonesian National Police, Attorney General's Office, including with other internal inspectorates, internal audit function in different government agencies and ministries, so that we can reduce the occurrence of corruption. That's the first point. The second point, in terms of procurement of public goods and services, we need to use technology. We need to introduce technology, introduce online system in terms of the bid offer, in terms of document submission. If possible, we don't need to have a face-to-face meeting between the bidder and the procurement team. This can reduce the risk of corruption and collusion and nepotism. So that's in terms of the enforcement. The next thing, as citizen, I think we can start to introduce moral education, character building from early on, so that when they grow up, they can grow into people of character with integrity and can avoid crimes in general. So I think those are some ideas on how to suppress corruption. But for me, the most important thing is we need to build synergy between stakeholders, including law enforcement officers and the general public. Next point, our next issue is about anti-corruption in the time of pandemic. Okay. Yeah, that's correct. In terms of the supervision or oversight activity conducted by the government, we know that in Indonesia, we have the National Economic Recovery Fund, which is very big in terms of the amount. So the KPK, the INP, and the AGO, but I would like to put emphasis on the KPK, have been monitoring the distribution of this National Economic Recovery Fund. we know that there is a case. I'm not going to discuss about the case itself, about the distribution of the social assistance, which is currently being investigated and prosecuted by the a case involving a Minister of Social Affairs on the distribution of social assistance to respond to pandemic-19. So basically, we have an integration between prevention and also prevention and enforcement. So in this case, we do this simultaneously, but of course we need to prioritize prevention and then enforcement, but at times we can also learn about prevention. So I think my bandwidth is dropping, so I would like to thank Pak Asri. Sophie, maybe you can give your response about the latest study at the global level
to adjudicate corruption crime yang tidak dapat diselesaikan di dalam negeri. Terima kasih.
That
Sophie.
cannot be resolved nationally.
Yes, so I've been trying to do some of my answering homework in writing already. So I've put in the answers, I've put in a link to U4's website on the COVID pandemic and corruption risks and what can be done to strengthen anti-corruption efforts. That is run by 3 of my colleagues with a focus on the health sector, because this is where most of the procurement is being done. This is where most of the money is, and this is where, you know, because of the emergency, the urgency to do things quickly, this is where the risks are highest. And I can really recommend looking up that website. There are several resources there on what can be done to mitigate corruption risks. I personally work more on the justice sector institutions, and I think for the justice sector institutions, it's been a tough time because it's difficult to do your investigations virtually, and it's difficult to hear court cases from one day to the next virtually. So I think the last, in many jurisdictions, the last year has been quite challenging, and how to actually organize it. And in some countries, the regular proceedings or regular cases have been put on hold, and law enforcement agencies were asked to only focus on the COVID related cases. And so I think ultimately, I mean, this will there will be a lot of cases waiting, I think, in many countries that need to be resolved. One thing we also looked at is kind of, you might remember last year when the outbreak just started, that a lot of prisoners were released around the world. So something we try to look at is kind of, what are the criteria for release? Is it how kind of corruption proof is that system? And we also have a short publication on that you will also find on our website about the International Anti-Corruption Court. Yes, I mean, there's a big, for those who don't know, there's a big discussion around that, and I think there are many people who are hoping that if things don't work out at the national level, it can be referred to an international court or higher institution, but that doesn't exist. And in a way, if the moment you bring up something up to the international level, there are even more interests involved. And we have looked at this discussion at U4, the pros and cons, and I believe it's highly unlikely that this is going to happen in the near future, but that we have lots of other instruments that we can use. And it's not, you know, finding this one, you know, it's not about establishing that one super body that can fix all of our problems, but that we work with what we've got. And so I think we should definitely work more across borders, not just in the investigation of cases, but also in bringing attention to when things get stuck and calling out our peers. Or, you know, anti-corruption commission looking a bit sideways on another anti-corruption commission if they drop a big case. So I think peer pressure is something we could definitely get better at. And I mean, in Southeast Asia, there are several regional networks for different kind of law enforcement institutions. And I think this is where a lot can also be done, where agencies can nudge each other and bring this to the attention when things get stuck. And as I said, something that might be more feasible than an international court is a UN rapporteur that collects evidence on these things and brings it to public attention. But the rapporteur would not be, could report on it, but would not be able to adjudicate on it.
Oke, terima kasih banyak Sophie atas insight-nya.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for your insight. The risk of corruption is indeed becomes higher during the pandemic. Thank you very much for sharing us with your studies and research. So in Mbak Fitri, Mbak Bibip, in this session, we want to ask about the possibility to have international court to handle cases that cannot be resolved domestically. The second question is about the cause of corruption. Is it because of bad system or is it because of the bad personnel? And the third one, what kind of corruption risk that usually emerge during the pandemic that maybe the government can take some measures to mitigate?
I'm sorry, suddenly my internet was just gone, even on my phone. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity, although I missed some of the answers from the other panelists before. But let me just quickly address, so I don't repeat what you have said, I guess. Let me just quickly address this question as just to underline what Francesco said before about contextual, and then also what Dato Sri Azam mentioned before about the need of political will. So about the contextual part of the independence, I agree with Francesco and also Sophie, who discussed this a little bit about it's not really the word independence itself, but we really have to look at the details of how the design of the independency has to be created. And for the design, we really have to see the context of each country. And if I reflect, I looked at also elsewhere, I mean, stories from other countries. But when I look at what is happening in Indonesia, this is particularly for Indonesian audience who probably tend to think that we should really isolate everything. Sophie also mentioned it in one institution. This is the way of thinking, I think, introduced after 1998 post-authoritarian Indonesia, that tend to isolate problems. We tend to, at that time, 1998 to 2005, around 2005, there's this big, I think also globally, tendency to isolate, or to create island of integrity, sort of island of integrity. So because of the environment, a certain environment is too corrupt, then we isolate some kind of independency and some degree of professionalism and all that in one pot, such as the KPK. So so in the context of Indonesia, again, if we look at what's going on, then we really have to face at least three problems. First, the law enforcement agencies in Indonesia. I'm sorry to say, but we still have a lot of problems. The police, the Attorney General's office, and the judges, even until now. We still face the issue where, for example, one prosecutor just got, we call it discount in terms of verdict, yeah, from 10 years to only 4 years in jail, because of reasons that are unjustifiable. And then secondly, we also have the problems in terms of the working method and the salary and the recruitment processes of civil servants. So putting the staff of KPK under the scheme of civil servants would also be a problem. And the third one is the political sphere in Indonesia that is still very much corrupt and unethical. So considering those at least 3 problems, then KPK was created. So if let me go back to the question. So what is the ideal? Contextual, but in terms of Indonesia, let me now address the other panelists that the problem is now we still can see the KPK, we can still see the commissioners, but if you look at it more thoroughly and really look at what's going on in the field, you will see that the current commissioners don't get much support from the civil society at this time. There's big gap even from the previous commissioners. So I believe Sophie has discussed this quite much with Bang Laude Syarif, the previous commissioner, for example, who stand with the other commissioners against the current commissioners. So there is big problem. So this is what probably in my presentation, I'm afraid my presentation did not really portray everything quite in detail, but the institution is there, the commissioners are there, but I believe in several years we will see the result, because really those investigators who are very effectively dealt with large-scale corruptions are now out of the scene. They are basically they are now fired, basically due to the tes wawasan kebangsaan, yeah, which was designed by the current commissioner under the law, which is actually incorrect, to get rid of those investigators. So this is what's going on now in the Indonesian context. And then secondly, about the criminal, about the tribunal, this is again for my colleagues in Indonesia to remind you that the existing tribunal is actually more of human rights, gross violations of human rights. One cannot just bring any cases that cannot be solved domestically to the international tribunal. First of all, it has to be in certain criteria, and most importantly, it should be gross violation of human rights. And then secondly, the country also has to be a member of the Rome Statute, which Indonesia is not. Yes, so I understand that this question mainly raised usually because many Indonesians feel quite hopeless about the current situation in Indonesian justice system. But that's unfortunately the fact. And lastly, about the pandemic, it's happening now in Indonesia, because probably some of the panelists already also read in the news how actually the one of the ministers involved in this whole pandemic support for the society is now convicted, social minister basically, when in terms of this social support, yeah, for during the pandemic. And there was also, I think 3 weeks ago, investigation from, and this is an important part from Francesco's presentation about the need of the investigative journalism, because some investigative journalists, they revealed also other facts regarding the corruption in the social support for the pandemic. because we have the government in lieu of law last year, basically to speed up the procurement process and all that during the pandemic. But apparently the government hasn't prepared the reporting system for that. And some journalists already found some leakages and many support already went to those who don't need the support, and much has been corrupted also by some officials. I give this back to Putri.
Terima kasih banyak Mbak Bibip. Saya menerima banyak pertanyaan mengenai sertifikat bagi para peserta.
Thank you so much. So to our participants, I have noticed a number of questions on the certificate of participation to this webinar. We do not have a attendance link because Zoom is automatically registered your attendance. So as long as you fill in or complete the registration form and you provide us with a working email, you will be able to get the evaluation. And because of Dato Sri has another agenda, so I have some final questions to Dato Sri. In the last theme of questions is about asset recovery. And it is a very important element in corruption eradication, especially cases involving vast quantities of assets.
How the obstacles of MACC in recovering 1 MDB assets from worldwide, including from the US, and do you only conduct criminal through criminal mechanism, or also civil suit to recover the lost asset in the 1 MDB case? Terima kasih, Dato Sri.
First of all, about the stolen assets in case of 1 MDB, I have to say this, there's none of the asset in Malaysia. So that even we have a very strong law in Malaysia, we can't recover the asset because the money which have been channeled to the former Prime Minister account, which is amount about 3.2 billion actually altogether, all have been spent by him for his political purposes and political agenda. And out of 42 billion money raised for 1 MDB, the money had been channeled out to overseas. As what I've shown you in the slide, where the money went to Good Stars and the money went to ABA, BBI, and so forth. And it is very biggest challenges for MACC when we wanted to recover the asset or the money from over the world. The biggest obstacle is the different jurisdiction. I would like to thank you, some of the very friendly countries like United States, Singapore, and Switzerland for helping us in bringing back the asset, especially United States, whereby until now, US has recovered billions of dollars, approximately about 2.5 billion returned back to Malaysia. And US very generous enough to return back the asset that they recover without charging us for any of fees and all that. So this is about the jurisdiction that we have to face. For example, that when we wanted to request any kind of asset recovery, we need to follow strict rules of the country's jurisdiction, especially on using mutual legal assistance. The thing that we have to, one of the best practices that I can propose to many countries now, if we have this kind of very big scandal like this, is to form a task force. So that's why, as I mentioned, that we have a good task force, international task force formed to bring back the asset to Malaysia. So Malaysia is a sovereign country, so we must almost respect the jurisdiction. So as I said, the biggest obstacle is trying to understand the laws of different jurisdictions and how MACC must maneuver to confiscate assets from various countries. We must also understand that ill-gotten monies also move from country to country, which makes the trail gathering of evidence very, very more difficult. we need to understand, for example, Switzerland authority, they have their own law, they have their own kind of appointment of councils when they deal with perpetrators like Tariq Obaid and Patrick Mohani. In US, they have for example, they have a deferred prosecution agreement. We don't have that in Malaysia. So in terms of charging criminals, we Malaysia we practice both. We don't have this DPA. And for example, in case of Najib Razak, we charge him, and hopefully that the money stolen will be recovered from other countries. Only for in Reza Aziz case, his stepson, we have a good collaboration with other states, whereby US they have seized amount of more than 170 million USD, and with the consideration that we need to withdraw his case, that enable US to confiscate his asset in US and United States, US and United Kingdom. And the rest of the cases, we don't expect that other countries to charge these people for criminal charges. That's much I can say, and hopefully, with many forums in the world, the platform that we can use to enlighten the usage of MLAs in asset recovery procedures. Thank you so much.
Terima kasih Dato Azam, ini memang pertanyaan.
Thank you so much, Dato. And the question on asset recovery mechanism exercised by Malaysia is information that our audience is very excited to hear. So thank you so much for sharing with us about the challenges in recovering the assets in other jurisdictions. And hopefully the answer is clear that there is ongoing efforts, and I hope the audience here and our law enforcement officers can learn from that experience. I think I hear about the importance of collaboration with other law enforcement officers between agencies, including foreign agencies. And Ibu Sophie had to leave the webinar just now because of her other agenda. But we are actually, we are 12 minutes behind of our initial agenda, but we are at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much to our audience. And so for those of you who have joined us, but you haven't completed the registration link, please do so. Please complete your registration. And again, we do not have the attendance link because Zoom record your attendance automatically or by system. And the materials that we can share from the panelists will be shared with you as well. So we are going to provide you with Google Drive link that you can use to download the materials today. And you'll also get a link for your e-certificate. So that's what you can expect. And this webinar is recorded in English, and we are going to publish in the UNODC regional website. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for sharing with us your gracious information, sharing and insights, and hope to see you again in another occasion. Thank you to our audience for your productive participation, and we will see you in the next webinar. Thank you. Peace be upon us.